Hi there. This podcast is really interesting if you are a frequent traveller. I caught up with Ben Mutzabaugh from The Points Guy. Now, like me, you probably think with a company name like that, it's all about frequent flyer points. And it is, but also a lot more. So have a listen, and Ben will share a few interesting tips and experiences that could help us all have a more comfortable seat next time. Enjoy. So this afternoon I'm joined by Ben Mutzabaugh from The Points Guy. Ben, hi, welcome. Good afternoon.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure. So The Points Guy strikes me as being all about frequent flyer points and the tricks of the trade. Is it?
Yes, we, are a website that is now 10 years old, and we started as a points and miles focused website, and that continues to be our bread and butter. So if you're looking for advice on miles and redemptions and just how the loyalty program works from a customer's point of view, we're your place. And now in the last year or two, we've increasingly started to cover airline news and analysis, often with a more traditional journalism take on it. And we feel that's complementary to the existing loyalty audience that we have. And so far, people seem to be pretty pleased with it. And that's what my role is at The Points Guy, is to kind of lead that traditional coverage that is more typical of a news website.
Sure. And I presume that anyone who's got any reasonable quantity of points with any airline is probably an avid follower, user of the airline and the aviation industry. So combining the two seems to me to make quite good sense.
That was our thinking too. I mean, I don't think it takes a lot of convincing to believe that those are overlapping audiences, and that someone with an interest in the points and miles scheme is probably interested in the airlines. I always liken it to covering sports. In a previous life, I was a sports reporter, and in the U.S., I use American football as an analogy. But let's say you're a fan of Manchester United in the U.K. and or the Dallas Cowboys in the U.S., and you might be interested in the team, but you probably also care about the owner. You care about the seats at the stadium. Mm-hmm. And so the owner is like the CEO. The stadium is like your home hub airport for your preferred airline. And I just think if you cover it like that, there's so many ways that people who are interested in this industry and are so passionate about it, there are so many things and facets about airlines and the industry they love to follow. And I think for a lot of people, it's like a sport to them, and they just love consuming every last bit of information about it.
Yeah, I fortunately, I'm not a Manchester United fan because the in-joke in most of the United Kingdom is you have to live outside of Manchester to be a Manchester United fan, but that's another story. So your background is your career is sort of from the journalistic perspective, isn't it? Because we first met when you were working for, was it USA Today?
That's right, yes. I joined USA Today as a sports editor for U.S. college sports in 2000. And that was a great gig that I really enjoyed. And I've always had an interest in the aviation industry. And in 2002, we launched a blog called Today in the Sky, which at the time was an unusual thing for a newspaper to do, to have a blog. And I was the person who was able to head that up, and it set me down a path of covering airlines for almost 20 years at this point.
So was it one of those early ambitions? I mean, if you had that sort of crossroads on your path, was it I'd rather be doing sports journalism or aviation journalism, and you've ended up where you are by default?
I would say I was pretty equally passionate about both industries. I think as a kid, I grew up wanting to be a sports reporter, but when that opportunity came up at USA Today, it was too good to pass up, and I convinced them to give me the job as a really young green reporter. I don't know how I pulled that off. I'd like to think it worked out well for everyone. It worked out well for me. But yeah, it's kind of a mix between, I don't know, I guess destiny and opportunity. I was at the right place at the right time. I was able to follow one of the two things that I probably am the most passionate about. So it all worked out well for me. I'd like to think it all worked out well for my employer, and I certainly would like to think it's working out well for my current employer at the Points Guy.
I'm sure it is. So how, every day there is an aviation story somewhere in the world. How do you pick and prioritize the stories and the angles? Because you could fill a book every day with aviation content, surely.
Yeah, that is actually one of the biggest challenges that I think, that we have here at the Points Guy, and, frankly, that I had at USA Today. I imagine that every other news site that covers aviation has to grapple with. Turn on the evening news. I assume it's the same in the UK as it is here in the US, but two of the top 5 stories in any given night could be something to do with the airline industry. It's something that people have such an interest in, and there's no shortage, as you said, of stories about it. So I think where it gets really difficult is you have these stories that are kind of like the unruly flyer stories, or kind of the things that are like the police blotter of the industry kind of stories. And they get a lot of traffic at a lot of sites, but I don't know how much readers get out of those stories. What is useful to them other than kind of like a morbid curiosity of seeing, the news equivalent of a car crash.
Yeah.
So we try to focus less on those, or those not at all, to be honest, and look at stories that either help travelers understand more about the industry or learn things that will apply directly to their travel experience. That's kind of the overarching kind of mindset to that. And obviously, as we cover airline news more, we try to just kind of you pull back the curtain, so to speak, and let people see how things are working at their favorite airline, or report on management decisions that, even if it might not affect a customer directly, affects the airline they fly and is something they might see in the coming year or two at the airport. So just more educational, informational, but we do try to stay away from some of the more salacious stuff. So, but there's always so much. It's hard to prioritize. Yeah. I won't lie.
So when there is, and when you were sort of pulling that curtain back this time last year on the airline industry, it must have looked in amazingly good health from just so many angles. Buoyant demand, expansion, low oil prices. Everything looked really, really good for everyone, didn't it?
Oh, gosh. Even early this year, it looked that way. And I remember, when I was talking to colleagues and other people in the media, even in early March, I don't think it had fully set in, at least not for most people, I don't think, how severe and extended this pandemic and crisis was going to be. So even in March, I think the thinking here in the U.S. is that all of the U.S. airlines had either restructured during the past decade or were so healthy that they didn't have to. But going into the 2010s and into 2020s, that the airlines had either restructured and were now probably in the strongest financial position they had ever been in. And they just had to weather the storm, and they had so much cash on reserve, and their balance sheets were good. We just kind of all assumed that, when things are back to normal by July, it will have been a bad quarter for the airlines, but they'll be okay. And, and here we are. Maybe someone predicted it, but gosh, I think it took 99% of us by complete surprise, the duration of the pandemic, and the fact that we don't really seem to be close to the light at the end of the...
It's a very frustrating and worrying time for anyone. So what was that moment, that sort of paradigm point when you realised, at least in your own mind, that this was a bit of a crisis that was happening?
Yeah, it took a while to sink in. even in April or here in the U.S., the number of passengers being screened at security was down 95% year over year. Like, you knew it was bad, but I think you still kind of had this idea that when things are better in July or in August or, by fall. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember exactly what the single one thing was for me, but there was one night of watching the news and it just kind of sunk in. And for me, frankly, I think for me it was sports. I told you that's my other passion. And for here in the U.S., the football season starts, American football season starts late August and really gets going in September. Mm-hmm. And I started thinking about my travel plans. Will I go to the football games? Would I be willing to sit in the stadium? And it was somewhere in May or June. Like, I don't think I'm going to do that. And gosh, are they even going to play? I don't even know how it's possible. And that's kind of where, for me, I started realizing how long it's going to be before normal life returns. And it's probably a year or two before anything close to normal.
Yeah.
Seems likely. And with that realization, if I'm not willing to go to football games or to travel in crowds for a year, well, that can't be good for the airlines. And so they're going to be in this too.
And I guess that is one of the real things about this is how travel. We took travel for granted, didn't we? And particularly air travel in the United States. It was part of the DNA to jump on a plane and go transcon from one meeting to another, etc. And you don't have many alternatives, quite frankly, in the US, do you? I mean, the train services are not really high speed, and they're certainly not transcontinental.
Yeah, I mean, the trains are great if you're going within the Northeast and maybe a few other places, but it's not an option, not a fast option for many people. And I think what's worrisome, and there's no rocket science to this. I'm sure this will be the first thing any airline management employee will tell you is, if regular workers aren't back in the office, they're certainly not going to be flying to other cities for meetings with employees of other offices that are closed if they're not in their own offices. So, and obviously business travel is really where a lot of the money for the industry comes in. Mm-hmm. So that's worrisome on the surface. Obviously, that's probably the single biggest thing I would be concerned about if I were an airline CEO, which is perhaps the most obvious thing. But to your point about air travel being taken for granted, I have really thought a lot about that in the recent weeks as we kind of try to get our grasp on how severe this is. Obviously, you've got the business component that we just talked about. But for here, and I'm sure there are European equivalents and equivalents all around the world, what struck me is, you've got some people who have second homes that are too far to drive to, mm-hmm. or vacation house, say someplace here, like in Florida or some remote place that for the last decade or two has been a $150 2-hour round trip flight, and it seemed like a reasonable thing to do, and you just assumed it would be available. But now there are no flights. There are a number of U.S. states that have quarantine requirements, and it's difficult to travel to and comply with law. And gosh, just so if you had bought a vacation house or even a timeshare or whatever, and you're used to traveling to Vermont or Florida or any place, it's just something we used to take for granted. And I just wonder what those people are doing. I just think that's a real tangible example of how we had just air travel become such a part of our lives that we've taken for granted. And now that it's gone, people really have to, I don't know what their options are for some of these things.
And you touch a raw nerve because I should be in my property in Florida this week, but hey, there you go. So we're all being impacted by this. But one of the really interesting angles, I think, and something that we just do not really appreciate the scale of in Europe, perhaps, is, and to the point of the points guy, is the power of frequent flyer programs. They are so strong in the United States, aren't they?
Yeah, there's. It was the whole genesis for our website, to be honest. the scale and reach and frankly, like as you said, the power of these programs in the U.S. market, which frankly is a little bit different than it operates in most other parts of the world. And the way that credit card companies can operate in the U.S., it makes the credit card value proposition very, very real to the airlines here. The short of it is that airlines can make a lot of money in this market from leveraging and maximizing their frequent flyer programs. You can team up with a bank to have a co-branded credit card that allows you, the airline, to sell hundreds of thousands, well, probably billions of miles at up to 2 cents a mile or so to banks that then distribute them to customers who are using the credit card for purchases. And it's really hard to overstate the value of that. And I think it's come to light again. We saw airlines take advantage of this mechanism during the Great Recession here in the U.S. Around 2008, around that time period, and we're seeing it again now. United Airlines values its Mileage Plus program at more than $20 billion. I think around $22 billion is the number that they cited. It earned nearly $4 billion last year just by selling miles to third parties. So I feel like those numbers alone just underscore what a cash generator, about a revenue generator these can be for the airlines in the U.S. market. And that's a little different here than it is elsewhere in the world.
So I think it was probably 30 years ago, Robert Crandall, famously quoted, founder, inspiration of American Airlines, was quoted as saying, "I'd rather sell the airline than sell Sabre, the distribution system." At that time. Now, airlines are probably saying, "I'd rather sell the airline than the Frequent Flyer Association and linkages I have." It's staggering, $22 billion. Wow.
Yeah. It's, you just think about, change is the one constant in the world, but I just wonder who in the 1980s would imagine that airlines make so much of their money in the future from selling airline miles and from credit card deals and from bag fees and from fees. I mean, that's where the profitable part of the revenue stream is these days. And, the airline operations are what that used to be the whole thing, are now just what that's layered on top of. And I'm sure someone predicted it in 1985, but I don't know. I think it would have been hard to imagine.
Yeah, I think Michael O'Leary, the CEO of Ryanair, was on record probably 15 years ago as saying, I'll give my seats away for free. And quite frankly, an airline seat is no more than a shelf on which you park your backside for someone else to try and sell you other products, isn't it? It's almost like going to the cinema and someone coming around with the popcorn and Cokes and trying to sell you other things.
Exactly. And if only he had a softer delivery of that message, he might be more highly regarded in the public sphere, I think.
Yeah.
He's 100% right.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean about that. But this is all liability that the airlines are building on their balance sheets in terms of redemption at some point, isn't it? Is this a ticking time bomb for some of these airlines?
That is an excellent question. And these are liabilities on the balance sheet. And, I think that's why we've seen an increasing number of ways for passengers to use their miles and frankly, inflation of what it costs to use the miles on actual flights goes up regularly, just like inflation does with real currency.
Yep.
But you can now use your miles to buy magazines, which we at TPG would tell you is a terrible value. There are lots of things you can do with your miles that are not even at all related to flying on an airline. Mm-hmm. But that's part of the way the airlines create these opportunities for you to spend these miles and take some of these liabilities off their balance sheets. But for now, it doesn't seem to be anything that the ticking time bomb seems to be down the road, but I'm not sure that it is at this point. They've been pretty creative about finding ways to keep the the earn part of it has always been top of mind, but now the burn part of it, they've been pretty good about finding ways to keep that going as well. But like most other things, this pandemic will certainly expose any weak spots or areas of any business, airline or otherwise, that could be stressed. So it will be interesting to follow that, I think, as we head from 2020 into 2021 and beyond.
Right. So just out of interest, and I'm not going to let you get away with this, you said, there are better ways to burn your points. What is the great inside tip I should take away? What is the most effective spend I would get of my points, do you think, at the moment?
Well, there are always some sweet spots, not always, I should say. There are frequently sweet spots that are hidden in different airline frequent flyer programs. So, the first part of it kind of depends on which frequent flyer alliance you might be partial to, where most of your miles or points are accumulated. And then there are some airlines that allow you to redeem these points across partners. Alaska Airlines, which until recently was unaligned before it announced plans to join oneworld, allowed you to redeem miles across airlines from various alliances, and that was always a great value. For me, I find great value in booking flights on airlines like Emirates or Etihad or Singapore Airlines that otherwise, in the premium cabin, that otherwise cost tens of thousands of dollars. And there are some deals that are better than others as far as the number of miles that it takes to book these cabins. But for me, as long as I have the miles, if I can fly to the Maldives or to Thailand or wherever on one of these airlines in a suite with a bed and at least pre-COVID, a shower, like that sounds pretty fantastic to me. And that's where I feel like that value is.
Yeah, that does sound like good value as we're worrying about post-COVID travel and all of the social distancing elements. So getting back, Ben, to some of the more mundane business type sort of areas, if you compare geographic regions of the world from your perspective, which parts do you think have handled the pandemic better than others? When you sit there and you look around and see which regions are at what state and phase, what's your learnings? What do you think has been the good bits that people should take away?
That is a tough question to answer. At least from where we sit, we've really had a rolling ability to get a hold or not of COVID here in the U.S. And I think that's been obviously frustrating and challenging. And I'm sure from the airlines' perspectives here that it's made it hard for them to do business when there are new hotspots that are popping up in different parts of the country. Because it's all domestic travel pretty much right now, obviously. Yep. But you look at the countries that have gotten it together. Italy struggled at the beginning when they were one of the first hotspots, and finally they really pushed out these, what seemed to be simple ideas of wearing masks and social distancing and don't gather in crowds of people in the dozens, let alone the hundreds, and we can get it back under control. And finally that worked there. That process has become a bit politicized in the U.S., which is unfortunate, but that's what we're struggling with here. But, I personally look to our neighbor to the north. Canada really seems to have handled this well early. Now you look down the road, is this something people get fatigued of or complacent with or get a false sense of security? This is going to be a tough thing. And maybe other people in other parts of the world that have handled it better than we seem to have think differently, but I think until there's a vaccine or something that really changes the game, this is just going to be kind of like a game of whack-a-mole, unfortunately. At least that's how it feels here.
And your readers and your audience are, as we said, high frequency travelers, very close to the industry. They're locked down to a large part at the moment. They must be frustrated. What are you hearing from them about the situation? Are they eager to travel, or are they reticent to get on an airplane?
We know that they're very eager to travel. So our audience is ready to they're eager to get back on a plane. A lot of them are ready to get back on a plane. That is tempered by we also hear from a lot of people who say they're ready to fly, but I'm concerned about social distancing. So, different airlines have different policies on selling seats to capacity or blocking some seats, and have been a little more out front with the messaging about the things they're doing to combat COVID and keep their planes germ-free. That really does seem to be resonating with a lot of our readers, but they're all pretty eager to get out there. I think right now what we have seen in the U.S. is people seem to be willing to travel to outdoor places, or places that allow outdoor opportunities, which seem to be key for preventing the spread of COVID is being outdoors. Mm-hmm. So here we're seeing places like the national parks in the West, or beaches, or those types of places. And, from an airline routes perspective, I think that's been fascinating. United, for example, has launched a number of routes to Florida that don't touch one of their hubs, which I think only underscores, I guess I wouldn't say how strong the demand is, but how bad it is everywhere else, that where there is some demand, that now makes the most sense for the airlines.
Mm. Yeah, and it is interesting to start doing hub bypass type sort of things and operate those on a point-to-point basis. But there is so much capacity around, or spare capacity, that taking advantage of those opportunities isn't that difficult for some airlines, is it?
No, and what choices are they left with, frankly? This pandemic, this crisis is really, I think, going to create a reset at many companies, at many airlines, across many industries, for sure. Let
me promote you to a senior position in the FAA or the administration in the US. What do you think are the key step changes that would restore confidence and could be achieved from what you're hearing and what you know, that would open the floodgates to traffic coming back?
Yeah, that's the $1 billion question, isn't it? I think from where I sit and from what I hear from our readers and from what I see, I feel right now in the U.S. anyway, the passengers who will be comfortable to travel with a vaccine are at least taking tentative steps to doing so with whatever conditions they feel they need to hit to make them to be safe. Mm-hmm. So that's, all of the airlines here are requiring masks, and the airports are mostly doing the same, and there are social distancing guidance, and it seems to be mostly followed here from what we're saying. I know the airlines would like the government or the FAA to roll out policies for masks and other recommendations so that it's not a piecemeal approach by the airlines, and that it has some enforcement teeth.
Yep.
I don't think the airlines would welcome that. I know they would welcome that. Maybe temperature screening conducted by the TSA. Those are the types of things that I think the airlines would be happy to see, just to kind of shore up consumer confidence. But that said, I think all of the airlines have done what they can to put forward a good face and show that they're doing something to minimize the risk. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's all for show. I think that, some of it actually makes a difference. Cleaning the planes, the face masks, the things that we now understand to be some of the most effective things you can do.
Yeah.
I just really think that it's going to take a vaccine at this point before we keep saying return to 2019 numbers. I don't even think that's on the table at this point, but before there's any sense of normalcy. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's going to be the people who are willing to travel and they've made their peace with the risks, and the people who aren't and they're going to drive or stay home. And I just think you're going to have those two segments probably for a while.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So let's turn to the recovery, because we're all confident there will be a recovery. What would be your time frame? I've been out and said I think it's now 2024. I've seen the first article that actually says the worst case scenario is 2027. But what's your sentiment in the US market? Do you think it's a relatively quick bounce back, or could it take until 2024?
Oh gosh, I hope it's not 2027, but I don't think you can rule it out. I think it's not the most likely scenario, but this will be fascinating. I think, I keep saying it hinges on the vaccine and when it comes and how effective it is. And I truly believe that. So if we do have something, fingers crossed, by the end of the year that's promising on the vaccine front, and we know by, say, spring of 2021 that it seems to work and is effective and doesn't have side effects, all of the things you might worry about, then I think there could be a quick demand. I think the real takeaway is once there is a vaccine and the general public is comfortable that it's safe and effective, right. So that means the real question is, when does this vaccine finally come along, and is it safe, and when can we be sure that it's safe and effective? So that's the real wild card for me about the when. But I think once that happens, we'll see a quick recovery just based on pent-up demand. I don't think it will snap back to 2019. I do think that that is probably 2023 to 2025 that we see back to normal, so to speak. But I just think the timing of it all depends on what happens on the health front.
Right. Yeah, and the sooner we find a solution there, the better. Tell me, how many members or how many avid followers are there of the Points Guy? It seems to me, because you have a UK website, you have a US website, at some point you must have an Asian website as well. How big is the following at the moment?
Yeah, well, we love our passionate and vocal and loyal readership. Obviously, we wouldn't be here without those folks. So we have about 10 million monthly unique visitors to the Points Guy. That is mostly in the US. We do have the UK site, which is new and growing, and they have done an excellent job in making a mark in the short time since they launched. We do focus mostly on US in this, obviously in the US market, as you would expect, but there's great interest here in some of the global airlines, of course. I mean, British Airways is a no-brainer, Virgin Atlantic is a no-brainer, but also airlines that are part of the big alliances and have products that people aspire to, the Japanese carriers, Singapore Airlines, Emirates, Etihad, Qatar. So there's a lot of interest in certain foreign carriers and certain foreign destinations, but the audience is so far mostly English speaking, with a focus on the U.S. and Canada and the U.K. Mm-hmm. I do think we will have, I think COVID has made everyone kind of reassess their expansion plans, but it would not surprise me if once the recovery gets on firmer ground, if you see a new, I'm not speaking with any inside information here. This is just my hunch based on how popular we seem to be with the readers who we're already getting. But, I could definitely see us having a site aimed at Asian travelers or maybe South American travelers based in Brazil. It does seem like a logical evolution for us. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see that later this decade.
Watch that space. So
yes.
The reason I ask is I have a really sneaky question where I'm going to ask you, what, in your own personal experience, here you are, you are part of the Points Guy. So there is an assumption you're extremely well travelled and versed. Who are your best and worst airlines, and what is the standout reason for that?
What an interesting question, and I may duck the worst one.
I was going to say that's optional because you still have to travel.
Yeah, we and I don't want to get us in the doghouse with
no, absolutely not. No,
we have to cover. They do enough to get in the doghouse, and we write about that. So they don't need my opinion on top of that, probably. I will say that it is a tough question to answer because what is the best airline depends on an individual traveler's need. And I can't tell you how many times someone will ask me, what's the best airline? And I truly think it depends on what your interests are. Mm-hmm. If you are looking for first-class travel and exotic destinations, you're going to want a global carrier. And then you can have the conversation about whether it's a international carrier like Emirates, if it's the best in the U.S., if it's Delta or United or American or what have you. But if you're really just concerned about getting to Florida or Arizona, or in your side of the Atlantic to Greece or Spain for $29 or 29 euros, and you don't really care about first class, then you will probably want to think about a Spirit or an EasyJet or Ryanair. I wouldn't necessarily say they're the best, but they might be the best for you. And if that's your interest, that's how I would qualify that. And I know it does sound like I'm sidestepping the issue there a little bit, but in the U.S., I would say the past few years, Delta seems to be at the top of its game. And I think few would dispute that. Now, if you don't live in Atlanta or Minneapolis, that might not be, or one of their hubs, it might not be the best choice for you.
Yep.
But they really seem to have run the best operation over the past few years and have really led with the customer experience. I do think that we've seen all of these things tend to be cyclical in the industry. There was a time where Delta was at the bottom, and, American and United are trying to catch up. JetBlue has ambitions of being an international carrier as they keep promising London service.
Yeah.
So you never know how these things might change, but if we had to go right now, Delta's the one everyone's aiming for in the U.S. anyway.
And I think you're right. I mean, all three US major carriers have made significant steps forward in their products, both in the hard and the soft aspects in recent years. But if you took those three out, Ben, and you were just looking at overseas international carriers, which is the one you're going to jump on if someone invites you?
Well, I always like those. First class is in play. Singapore, Emirates, Etihad. Those jump to the top of my list just for the sheer decadence of the product. Mm-hmm. And the service at Singapore is probably just, that's hard to beat on a consistent basis with what Singapore does. The Japanese carriers run a nice operation. Cathay Pacific, I don't know what the future holds for them. They really will probably have to reinvent themselves given all the headwinds they have faced. Mm-hmm. But Cathay Pacific stands out to me. In Europe, I have a soft spot for KLM. Maybe they don't have some of the, luxe cabin products that other airlines have. But for the few years that I was flying mostly with SkyTeam, I was always very excited to have a KLM flight. I thought the crews were just fantastic, and I always enjoyed flying with them.
And picking up your Delft piece of china as you got off the aeroplane,
exactly,
of course. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, they are a very good and a consistently human airline, which I think is quite important. So, Ben, we're running out of time. What do you really, if you look forward, we all have to be optimistic about the future because, it is going to be a tough journey, but we are going to come out the other side. What do you think the key learnings that the airline management teams will be taking away from them through this pandemic crisis? Is it the need to cut very quickly? Is it the need you can never have enough cash? Is it, work more with your partners rather than trying to do everything? What do you think are the key learnings for the guys at the top who are going to help us recover and be where we were in January of this year?
I think probably a combination of all of those things, and I think it's interesting that the airlines, some critics said the airlines should have had more cash on hand. Maybe that's true. I don't know that you put in your business plan to have enough cash on hand to handle a once in 100-year health crisis.
Yeah.
But the thing that I'm hopeful for is that I think they're going to focus on all of the things that you've mentioned. But what I'm hopeful for is we've seen airlines across the world increase their focus on customer service because they have to right now to make people comfortable to fly. Right now, it's just to get them on the plane.
Yeah.
And maybe some of that was lost during the past decade, at least in the U.S., after the lean years of the airlines, and they really did have to cut costs to survive. And at that time, that meant cutting customer service. But you can't really do that right now in the pandemic because people have to feel comfortable. They can't feel like a number on a $19 fare jammed into a plane. That obviously doesn't work today. So airlines have had to step up, whether it's safety or just how they're engaging and interacting with their customers. They've had to step up customer service. And maybe I'm naive, but gosh, wouldn't it be fantastic if that is one of the legacies of airlines getting to the other side of the pandemic? Yes, they'll have had cuts, and yes, there are certain things that will have evolved and changed, but it's been easy to hate airlines this century, and maybe we get to the other side. The airlines focus on customer service just enough that people say, hey, flying isn't what it was in the 50s when it was so expensive, but gosh, my airline treats me okay.
Yeah.
I hope we can get to that point.
Yeah, that's a really good insight, because at the end of this, it is a service industry, but more importantly than anything else, it is a people industry, and be that the cabin staff, the operations people, the reservations teams, and from the other side, the passenger who's a bit more accepting of when things do go wrong. If we could all just show a bit more humility on every journey, then you'd probably think the world's going to be a better place.
No, those are words to live by. I can't think of anything better than that.
Wow, I'm staggered. I don't think I've ever been in that space before. Ben, it's been an absolute pleasure to reminisce and talk through some of the issues, and I wish you the best of luck with the Points Guy, because I think it's a great publication and a great website, and it's one of my go-to sources of stories, so long may it continue. Thank you very much.
I'm glad to hear that. We'll do our best. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.